Hi, John McCarty here with Odyssey Test Prep. I'm joined by Tim. So, Tim, how are you today?
Doing good, John. It's nice to meet you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic to be chatting with you. So, fill everybody in a little bit about your experience with the LSAT and kind of how you prepped and kind of what you're doing with it now.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't have like the highest educational background going into it. Like I didn't my high school and college were places where like I didn't even know going into the SAT per se what was going to be on it. I took it cold and still did
Mm,
rather well. So when I decided I wanted to go to law school, it was something that was kind of scary in the moment. And I remember initially like
yeah.
taking a diagnostic and actually doing fairly well on it. But after that, in my preparation, it was kind of panicky almost. And I would get, um, kind of upset and not understand. I would get a question wrong and kind of just immediately move to the next one. And it was
Mm,
kind of helter skelter and sort of frantic in my preparation at first. And I almost started I was spending so much time preparing in those initial stages, but it wasn't efficient time. It was time spent sort of just trying to like power my way through it without pausing to think about how to best approach these questions. So I actually started getting worse. And then I realized kind of, okay, I need to deeply understand and have a specific approach going into each of these questions, into each of these passages, into each of these games in order to best um, like have the best shot of answering this question correctly. So
yeah.
um, yeah, and then so I took it once, and I remember test day I was so panicky, and I was sort of like it was sort of I treated it so life and death, and I think
Yeah.
the LSAT is an interesting thing because it's obviously such an important test. Thousands of dollars are dependent on your score in a sense. Your whole career. So that is both true, and yet it's also true that for me, how I ended up doing my best is sort of being at peace and understanding to best approach this and do my best on this test. I need to slow down. I need to
Hmm.
maybe take 20 minutes on a single question that I got wrong, really understand what is the logic behind why I got this wrong, what are the basic principles of why I got this wrong, and go from there so that next time I receive a similar question, I can have a better approach. So my first time taking it, yeah, didn't do as well. And then um, in my preparation after that initial test, really changed how I prepared. It was more quality over quantity and
Yep.
did a lot better, yeah, the next time around. So,
Yeah. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make is they want to they get in there and they're just like, hammering questions, trying to do as much as they possibly can, but maybe not taking the time to just, you know, relax a little bit, slow things down and really focus on getting those fundamentals. And it takes a good amount of time to, go through one question where you understand every aspect of that question from start to finish by the time you're done with it.
yeah, and that's what I tell students is for some it's intuitive, for some, probably a small percentage of people.
Yeah.
And for me, it was almost intuitive at first, and I almost overthought it and got worse in a sense, and then had to reacclimate myself. But I think a lot of it is our new forms of thinking. Even if you've, studied really hard in school, read a lot of deep, hard texts and things like that. I think just the sort of formal logic that is inherent into the test
Hmm.
happens is like one comforting thing that I found was that there is a single perfect answer for every single question. So I think in those initial stages, it's really easy to be like, how is that correct? And then, but it's like, there's a bit of hubris there.
There
So
is.
you need to stop and understand what is the underlying thing of why that
Yeah.
answer choice is correct because it's perfectly correct. It's
Yes.
perfectly correct, Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say with the caveat of a few questions, like a handful of questions, if you pull them up from like the early '90s that were
Right.
not quite as dialed in, decades and decades ago. But at this point, I haven't seen a question that wasn't, you know, super dialed in, perfect. Like you said, there's one perfect answer choice, and this is the thing. One of the things that people maybe don't understand at the beginning is that it's not that this is better than the other choices. The other
Yes.
answer choices are wrong. They're fully wrong. There's something that makes them incorrect, and the correct answer choice is the only one that can do the function that the question's asking you to do. So it's not that it strengthens more than another one, or it's somehow more true on like a must be true question than something else. It's the only one that fits the criteria.
Exactly, and that's something, especially in the early stages of when I have a student that I have to get out of their system. They're like, "Well, these two are both basically the same," and it's like, one is if how can we understand what is clearly the answer choice that is because they're not the same at all actually, but
Right.
it's understanding what is the logic, what is the flaw, what is, if it's necessary assumption, what is needed by the argument to be true. Okay, well, this could be, and so that's where it really is important to sort of get these, like, understanding necessary and sufficient, understanding,
Yeah.
um, the different kinds of flaws that you'll see on this test almost before you jump fully into the questions, and not necessarily before, but I think that's why reading, to me, in LR at least, reading the stem is first is so important, in that you want to be able to almost predict as best as you can what the answer choice will be, because those answer choices are there to throw you off, you know um
Yeah.
so yeah.
And one of them will almost always one of the wrong answers
Exactly.
will look really good at first pass, right? Um,
Yes.
but it's important to be able to recognize the area that it ends up failing. Whatever the criteria is that you're
Yeah,
looking for.
that's a good way to put it, for sure. Yeah, one is clearly wrong, one is clearly correct, so how can we best understand what is behind that? Yeah, I
Yeah,
would
and
agree.
understanding, one of the things that I found that I had to do, and that with a lot of students I've had to do, is really just understanding what is the question they're asking us.
Yeah.
Like on weekend questions, it's kind of intuitive, but like, I found on, let's say, reading comprehension questions where they
Mhm.
say, uh, you know, the author would be most likely to agree with which one of the following. Like knowing that they're looking for something that must be true on that question type is
Yeah.
super important because you're bringing a whole different set of skills. And it's like, instead of like, all right, well, they said some of this stuff, so maybe they also would probably think some of this
Right.
other stuff. You know what I
Exactly.
mean? Which is how a lot of
Yeah.
people do approach that question type.
Yeah, I always say, like, we need to have a clarity of purpose, be super clear in our clarity of purpose, that we infer from what it's asking us. So literally, what is it asking of us? And each word, because on the LSAT, a single word can within the stem, within reading comp, within the way a question is formed, will change what the correct answer is, basically.
Hmm.
And so that's where we have to read intently, and also, yeah, have a, like, narrow our specificity in our focus, to what is it asking of us. And yeah, I think
Yeah.
with reading comp, it's so important to understand, like, it's all there in the text.
Yeah.
It's all there in the text.
Yeah.
It's either must be true or it's an inference that we take directly from the text. And I think sometimes we choose wrong answer choices because we rush and we don't fully comprehend the text, which is a hard thing in and of itself. And then,
Hmm.
we choose something that could be true. Like, I could see that, but we can't take it from the
Right.
text, and either through an
Yeah.
inference or directly written, basically, from the text. So
Yeah, and the key with an inference too is an inference is something that must be true. It may not have been explicitly stated, but if A then B, if B then C, if A then C must be true. But maybe they didn't explicitly state that. So it's important for people to have that really high bar because sometimes I think people are looking for like, yeah, assumptions, or they've got assumption and inference kind of,
tricks.
mixed up in their mind.
Sometimes they're looking for, like, little tricks, and I'm like, there really aren't tricks. There's understanding,
Yeah.
and it gets fun the more and more you understand. Like the more and more you have those basic, oh, they said if then that, and you understand these
Mhm.
kind of sort of basic logical things. And the logic in them is basic. The words might be confusing as anything, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes what helped me was almost forgetting the words and just seeing the logic. And on those harder logical reasoning questions, on those harder reading comp passages, I think that's really important is to see the logic behind the words. The words almost obviously they do matter, but they almost don't matter. What matters more in you getting the answer correct is seeing the if and then, I think at least, Yeah.
Yeah, and it's certainly, like, for the like, the specifics of it, you can go back and reread those words, right? But it's really hard to, especially, like, on reading comprehension, to reread for logical structure that's happening that's kind of, like, bigger than just this word or this phrase. It's these few sentences that aren't maybe right next to each other, and so if you're not catching that stuff on the first go around, then going back becomes more difficult. If you have the logical structure and you need to go back and say, did they say it was, France, or was that Germany that they said there? And you can go back and double check that very
Yeah.
easily.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Like with reading comp is some students, and I was like this too. I was underlining. I remember I was like, I need to underline, and I remember finishing a passage, and I underlined almost after the fact. I was like, holy moly! I just underlined the whole passage basically, in
Yeah.
a sense, instead of getting the major point. What is the author saying? What is the author thinking, big picture wise? The logical structure of it, and then yes, if I need the details, I can just refer back to it. But I can almost at the end of this passage say to myself in a couple sentences, what was the author trying to say, clearly and
Hmm.
succinctly, and that's what I tell the students, like, take your time to read, and when you're done, tell me, like, in two sentences, what was two, three, sentences, what was the author really trying to say? Were they argumentative? Were they passive? Were they really, really opinionated? Or were they kind of just giving us information, Um, and it's for reading comp, I enjoy that conversation you're having both with yourself while you're reading it and with the author. Like, oh,
Yeah.
now you just changed your opinion, or now you just really went full bore in this way. And
Yeah.
for me, in my own development with the test, was trying to make it fun because it's like I'm spending all this time prepping.
Yeah.
It's really important. Anything I've gotten better at in my life, at some point I found fun, and
Yeah.
it was challenging. It's still not. It still is challenging, but if you can find fun in, like, oh, I see the logical structure in this, or oh, this author is really funny, and I see exactly what they're saying, and then that really does, I believe, like lend itself to getting answer choices more and more correct. Um,
Yeah. For sure. And, people, general advice out there is to, like, find something that doesn't feel like work to you and do a ton of it, and you'll be amazing at it. And then you'll be able to dominate whatever endeavor that you're going after. So we can kind of reverse engineer that and say, all right, if you're doing something that maybe isn't on its face fun, like reading comprehension sometimes, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, if you can find a way to make it fun, then you're going to be able to do more. You're going to be more engaged. You're going to be more interested. You'll do more reps. You'll do more, like, meaningful reps, not just like glossing
exactly.
over it and,
Just going
trying.
through the motions, and then you're like, I gotta get this right. I think that's almost bad. Like, I always say process over outcome, kind of. If I can have perfect process that I'm comfortable with, where I'm really focused, really dialed in, the outcome will come. But if all I'm focused on is like trying to just like clench my fists to get questions correctly, I'm not going to understand it. And understanding is the key with this test. Like, it's a quick, fast test where efficiency of understanding is paramount, So how can I best understand that? That's not a clenching of the fist type thing. Obviously, you still need to put in the time and put in the time that is efficient. But again, I don't know. For me personally, I have to have fun with things, or I just don't want to do them. So, you know.
Yeah. What about this objection though, Tim? Tim, I can't take 20 minutes per logical reasoning question on the exam. I'm gonna, that's only a 35-minute exam. So
Right.
how am I supposed to balance that?
Yeah, and that's where I think it's important to have different approaches with how, the difference between taking a full timed real deal test where,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously I might skip a question. I might, be running out of time and have to click through. And yeah, you're just trying to mimic test day. And then
Yep.
there's that. And then there's, just a single time section where it's the same sort of principle, but within one section. And then I think it is what I would say to that student is it's just as valuable, especially in the early stages, for you to be taking a full length test as it is to to spend an hour practicing 20 minutes or doing 3 questions in 1 hour, 3 LR
Mhm.
questions, Um, because you can, I believe, like legitimately understand sufficient and assumption, or sorry, necessary and sufficient within one
Mhm.
question if you really take your time within that one question and really think about it deeply. Um, so I would tell them that it may not seem like this to you, but it's just as valuable to your development within this test for you to be able to take 20 minutes on a single LR question or an hour on a single reading comp passage.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that is just super important. Just the difference between practice and game day, right? And
Yeah.
then when you're like scrimmages where you're simulating game day, you're going to be going at speed and doing your test taking strategies. But like when you're learning, it's a totally different process than when you're performing, right?
Yes.
Um, imagine a ballerina, trying to learn particular moves. Like she's going to take her time and really work out the mechanics of those moves. And then what you see on stage is completely dialed in, perfect. But there's no way to get there without those baby steps kind of leading up to it, right?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect analogy, because it is that difficult of a test to do well on in that it's a ballerina thing. Or I used to work at a country club in college, and I would watch all these, golfers come in. They play every day and never get better at the same time, you know? So, but it's like, why do they never get better? Because all they're doing is game day. They're
Right.
only just playing. They don't fix their swing. They don't come back to the fundamentals, say, where am I going wrong with this? Where am I what do I need to change in my approach in this game? What do I need to come back to the basics? Like maybe I developed a crazy quirk that does no value for me out on the course. And
Hmm.
these things can all happen, I think, in LSAT prep, which is why it's so helpful to have a tutor, obviously, but it's
Yeah.
also helpful to just come back to the fundamentals and basics. But and then within that is understanding the fundamentals and basics of, okay, what do I need to work on, and it may seem boring at first and tedious. I think tedious is probably the right word, but it's really
Yeah.
important for a student's development in this test.
Yeah, I like the idea of there's like a quirk in the swing, and it's sometimes it's really hard for you as the individual who has that particular quirk to realize it and see it. But if you have a coach come in and watch you swing once, they'll be like, "Oh, I see what's going on here. I've seen this before. You're
Yeah.
dropping your shoulder or whatever you're doing." And we, we got
And
this is
there's
the
another thing in golf called Tiger Woods talks about it. We're talking about golf a lot, but feel versus real. So,
uh-huh.
like, you might say, "Oh, that feels," like, if you have a golf instructing coach, right? You might say,
Hmm.
"Oh, that feels so off and strange," and then they take a video of you, and it looks perfect, and you hit the
Yeah.
ball perfectly. But to you, it
Yep.
feels so strange, and I think uh, there's a strong correlation there with the LSAT in that, approach might be really different. Like, oh, but I always in LR or something, I always read the question first and then I come back to the stem. So I have the question in mind. Like it's gonna feel really weird for you if you read the stem first for a while. You
Hmm.
might be worse for a while, but in the
Sure.
long run, is your efficiency gonna become better? I would say most of the time, yes.
Hmm. or even like diagramming out conditional reasoning statements,
Yeah.
and you're like, a lot of times that feels painfully awkward at
And you're
first
like,
where
"I have
you're
no time. How do I have time?" Right.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, it takes a long time on those first few goes to try and get that stuff, really dialed in. But I do think those are kind of necessary steps that you have to go through. And then at some point the I think the real becomes feel. Like it starts to feel right. It
Exactly.
starts to feel good.
Exactly.
The results are coming and like everything starts to build up.
And then you get into a flow state where you're just having a good time with it almost.
Yeah.
Obviously, on test day is never a good time, but when you're practicing, you're like, "I just got wow, this is." And when it starts clicking because of those, you know, creating a system where those fundamentals are in place first, and then we go from there to the questions, then it really does start clicking, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have found that is the case. Like you get these like moments of things clicking for the LSAT, and that's why I think we were talking earlier. If you spend 20 minutes on, let's say, a necessary assumption question, you may learn everything you need to learn about necessary assumption questions through the example of that one question. And maybe not every iteration that you'll ever see, but you may have that moment where you're like, oh, I get it. I know what I'm supposed to do
I
on this.
had those moments for sure where I kind of made like a leap
Yeah.
and within LR and was like necessary assumptions, sufficient and necessary. Like, oh, that's clearly a part to whole flaw. And you don't
Hmm.
even this. I like naming them because it helps with teaching, but you might not even be naming those things, and you just
Yeah.
know you just see them. And it does kind of you get into a flow state. And the beautiful thing about the LSAT is it's a repetitive test. It
Yeah.
tests the same, logical structures. It hits the same beats within reading comp. So yeah, if
Hmm.
you understand, I always say for instance, with necessary and sufficient questions, you might see 3 or 4 of those on a single section.
Yeah.
And if you just see it right away and you can do that answer, you can do that question efficiently in like 1 minute because you see it right away. I mean, that's the difference between, that's a few point score difference right there.
Yeah.
Um,
And for the majority of test takers, I would say necessary assumption is one of the harder question types too. So if you're dominating in a question type that's a lot harder for other people, that's going to get you in the advantaged position when it comes, when they're scaling the test
exactly.
and when, you know, and time wise too, because they're anticipating that this section, if it has 4 necessary assumption questions, that it's going to slow people down quite a bit. Those questions, and if you plow through those in a minute a pop, you're on the right side of things.
Exactly. And that is a comforting thing I tell the students too. Like these the test creators know what they're doing. They know, oh, that's a really hard question.
Hmm.
And obviously it's a hard test in general, but they can't there's gonna be an evening out somewhere, and that's okay to
Yeah.
not get totally caught up, at least on test day, on a question for like 5 minutes. Um, yeah, and then I think what's beautiful about understanding these principles is that within harder questions, within, the last 2 reading comp passages, within the last 10 questions of LR, they're going to be testing the same logical principles in LR, the same sort of flaws, the same sort of strengthening. It's just going to be a more difficult stem or maybe harder to see. So for me, within making it easier to do well on the second half of sections, which I think it's everyone sort of knows that those are harder questions
Yeah.
and harder reading comp passages. I like to have the students, really just work on when they first are starting out on those first 13 LR questions in the first 2 reading comp passages and really can I get this whole reading comp passage, the first one, correct, no matter how long it takes me, or can I get the first 5 LR questions correct? Because those same things are going to be tested just in a more difficult way in question
Yeah.
21, 22, 23.
Yep. And you know, like you said, with people, if they hit something that's really hard, there's going to be a balancing out of the section. I would also tell people, like, if you're cruising and you're just crushing, there still may be a balancing out of the section. So don't let your foot off the gas. Go all the way. And I've hit some reading comp set passages where I'm just like, the brakes all of a sudden come on, and you're like, oh
I
no, this
yeah,
is like,
those first 3 are like, "Whoa, and then you get the last reading comp, and it's I don't know, something where you're like, what did I even just read?"
yeah.
And that's where, it is kind of like a muscle, this test. You really have to train it where I mean, the first bit of time when you're preparing, it's so easy to run out of steam. Even if you know what you're doing, it's easy to run out of steam. And that's where your approach is so important in getting quality reps, right? Not what is the saying, not practice makes perfect, but perfect practice makes perfect. I mean,
Hmm.
yeah. So
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think this has been great. I think people will probably pulled a lot out of this, and hopefully some of the people who watch this will, be able to adjust their approach to make sure that they're getting that perfect practice, so that they can start to approach perfection on the exam. And I wanted to thank you for coming on, Tim. I really appreciate it and had a great conversation.
yeah, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it too.
All right, we'll talk soon.
All right, sweet. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.